Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Bingham from Geography and Environmental Studies. I'd like to welcome you all to the latest in the seminar series of the OU's Centre for Global Challenges and Social Justice. I am delighted today to be able to welcome my colleague, Dr. Alessandra Marino, to share some of her research with us. Ale is Senior Lecturer also in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. She is a core member of the research group Astrobiology OU and explores how debates around ethics, environmental justice, and methods of research are framed both in relation to Earth and outer space. She has been co-PI of 2 projects funded by the UK Space Agency on the use of space technologies for environmental monitoring, led by Indigenous communities in the Amazon. And she is principal investigator of the UKRI-funded interdisciplinary project Moonrise, Reimagining Space Environments, which is officially starting next month. And she also chairs the UK-based expert group EAGLE, which stands for Expert Advisory Group for the Guidelines on Lunar Activities. So Ale is going to present today on careful lunar exploration, you can see from the slide. As usual for these seminars, she's going to speak for about 40 minutes, which should leave us about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. I will keep an eye on the chat for any questions that come up during the presentation, but there's an opportunity at the end for people to raise their hands and come in directly during the discussion. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass to you, Ale, if that's okay. I'm going to mute my mic but leave my camera on.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thanks everyone for being here today. What I'm going to do today is to speak a little bit about the direction that my research has taken, particularly in the last year and a half. I've worked for a longer time within astrobiology OU, where my work has been centered around the relationship between sustainable practices on Earth and outer space, and the ethics of that. But I have now kind of focused my attention a little bit on lunar exploration and the kind of issues that are related to particularly exploration of the lunar surface. So I'll introduce a little bit the context of competing claims on the lunar environment, and then I'll talk about the possibilities and shortcomings of discourses and existing discourses on protecting the moon, and in what ways do we talk about protecting the moon and its particular sites. And then I'll give you also a bit of an insight into the kind of work that I'm doing at the interface between science and policy that has led me to present at the UN at the Committee for the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space last month, where I had the pleasure to join the UK delegation and speak a little bit about science preservation on the moon. And finally, but that's actually my starting point, as you will see from the first slide, I will foreground what is it that a geographical approach can do for us to be able to bring Earth and the moon and concerns that relate to both of them closer together. So as I said, we start from geography. And the first question that I often get is outer space like a domain of geography? There is a contradiction in terms, because geography does mean writing the Earth. However, geography does do much more than that, and does it in many ways. So what I take inspiration from is kind of nicely encapsulated in this quote from Edward Said, the Palestinian author and critic, who, writing about the conceptions of the Orient, wrote, "Just as none of us is outside or beyond geography, none of us is completely free from the struggle over geography. That struggle is not only about soldiers and cannons, but also about ideas, form, images, and imaginings." That's very much where I place part of my work, because what I look at is ideas of outer space, its images, the ways in which we imagine it, and what that kind of imagination does to the ways in which we act upon a particular environment. So in that sense, I very much place my work in dialogue with the different and many ways in which the moon is conceptualized for ideas of protection, but also for the possibilities of exploration and exploitation of possible and existing resources. So the ways in which we think about geographical thinking is the fact that geographical thinking allows us to look at places, policies, and landscapes, and the ways in which they are reinvented. In this sense, my understanding of the moon is geographical because I put into contact and into dialogue issues of place, the ways in which we imagine the moon from different perspectives and different communities, but also the ways in which policy creates images of the moon and ways of governing it. I also think this work is geographical because it looks at the interconnection between the societal and biophysical dimensions of the processes that shape and have shaped the lunar surface. So I will say a little bit more about the specifics of lunar sites and certain types of sites that are deemed to be of particular scientific importance. But I also have sort of a cultural angle to this, and I was very much kind of inspired by this poem from the Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges that looks at the moon as one and many, and that idea of one and many, like the multiplicity of the ways in which we think about and value the moon, is at the heart of the project that I will talk about a bit more. That's called Moonrise. So we all have an experience of looking up at the moon and sort of think about the ways in which that moon seems to have been unchanged for humanity throughout history. So, but the reality is that the moon, as we know it, is changing, and it's going to be changing much faster and more in the next decade or so. We are looking at, we're going to have potentially as many moon missions in the next decade as we have had in the last 6 decades. So that will put pressure on and change an environment that has been sort of near pristine for a long time. However, that near pristine, we will talk about more in terms of what does that mean and what kind of like the expectations are for understandings of contamination. So the moon is one in many because it's one interconnected environment, but it's also a diverse celestial body. It has different areas that are worthy of being sort of protected. It has, large impact craters. It's got smaller craters. The lunar poles are kind of quite different in terms of the ways in which they are in parts of the regions are in permanent shadow, so they contain craters that are understood to possibly have water ice. So that diversity of the lunar environment is also under the spotlight. Culturally, the moon is one celestial body that is understood and valued in very many different ways by different communities. So placing the moon in relations is part of the ways in which we can understand it differently. So rather than taking for granted the image of the moon that seems unchanged when we look at it, or like the version of the moon that comes from only scientific accounts of it. What we can look at is these different ways in which the moon is multiple. And I'll start with an anecdote in terms of how the different values of the moon have shaped discussions around what is an acceptable or an unacceptable use of the moon as a surface, and particularly the lunar surface. But the Navajo Nation has been objecting to ashes being sent on the moon since 1998. In 1998, the ashes of the planetary geologist Eugene Shoemaker were sent to the moon on a NASA mission. The Navajo Nation was quite vocal about that not being an acceptable use of the moon, particularly because the moon is sacred and holds a sacred place in the Navajo cosmology, and the idea of transforming it into a resting site for human ashes was unacceptable to the Navajo community. After that incident, NASA agreed that no similar kinds of mission would be allowed without prior consultation of indigenous nations. However, fast forward about 20 years, and a commercial mission plans to send ashes to the moon, and there's now like more than one company that has that as their primary business, facilitating the sending of human remains onto the moon. And there again, Boone Nygren, he's the president of was the president of the Navajo Nation at that point, took to social media and to strongly denounce the fact that these kinds of missions go against the Navajo cosmology, but also that there were previous arrangements that were completely disregarded in this new area in which the commercial missions sort of like becoming more and more a part of the ways in which we see the space sector operating. Part of the response from NASA at that point was, this isn't our mission. This is a commercial mission, and there isn't that much we can do about it. So that poses like specific questions about what are the acceptable sort of activities that we think about in relation to the moon. Where does exploration, the idea of exploration sort of starts to border other ways of like of using the different celestial bodies, like exploitation. Where's the limit between the two? How do they meet? But also, where is it that, and how, what are the mechanisms that we have to stop activities if these are deemed to be in any way harmful? And by harmful, I'm not only referring to environmentally harmful, but also harmful in terms of like in a much more wider sense culturally. I'm talking about harmful contamination because that is one of the very few principles that we can refer to, and that is enshrined in the Outer Space Treaty. There's people in the audience that I can see there are experts in space law, but I'll just give a couple of lines to orientate sort of everybody in relation to the moon and what is kind of the current state of play of space law. Fundamentally, the only kind of treaty that we refer to as being widely endorsed and still quite current is the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty was as a treaty of 1967. It's kind of looked at pretty much widely as the foundation of space law and kind of this foundation of the spirit in which we look at other celestial bodies. What it does is says quite explicitly there is no sovereignty claims on other celestial bodies in outer space. There's no sovereignty claims. Sovereignty is not an issue. Like you can't just go somewhere and put your flag and say this is my space, this is my territory. That's in breach of international law. However, as we will see, there are other issues. But it also does say that harmful contamination is forbidden. So harmful contamination meaning contamination that has the potential to affect life. I mean, this is one of the interpretations of that clause. It's not the only interpretation, but it's a widely sort of understood interpretation that puts particular emphasis on life. And there are other ways in which, activities can be harmful. So part of the work that has been done ever since has been to create guidelines that also take into account and kind of more soft law that takes into account the ways in which environmental protection, for example, can be looked at, sustainability can be looked at and sort of supported. However, most of space law of the last couple of decades has been soft law. So it's voluntary guidelines. They're not enforceable. They rely on the goodwill of parties that have come together to talk about them. A moon agreement does exist. However, it only has 17 parties that signed it. The UK is not party to it. The US is not party to it. Bigger space players are not party to it, and it's still considered quite contentious, particularly because of the language that it has around common heritage, like the moon being common heritage of humankind. That was something that the US opposed quite strongly, and that still remains a contentious issue. Pretty much everywhere where there's kind of a bit of discussion about the moon agreement, except in the 17 countries that are party to it. When you mention the moon agreement, rooms of lawyers go silent. So it's generally a non-starter in the UK as for a conversation around the moon, unfortunately. But what is interesting is that taking all these different treaties and guidelines and the ways in which kind of we understand the lunar surface from a legal perspective, it is clear that the issue is not sovereignty itself. However, the issue is more around the use, appropriation, and control over resources. Now, the US has about 60 countries that have signed up to their Artemis Accords. Artemis Accords are bilateral accords that the US has sort of signed with all these different countries, and they have created a particular Artemis interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty. And the Artemis interpretation is that you can utilize resources on other celestial bodies, and that doesn't equate appropriation. So that just means use. And the Outer Space Treaty itself is pro-use, so this interpretation is completely congruent, in their view, with the Outer Space Treaty. The Artemis Accords are very much supportive of commercial plans, and the UK is a signatory to the Artemis Accords. But what we're seeing is a little bit kind of like the creation of two different blocks, where there's the Artemis group that has a particular interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty and sort of the directions of travel of current activities in space in general. And then there's the China-Russia-led ILRS, the International Lunar Research Station, that sort of like is constituting a little bit of a different block. Fundamentally, the question on the table is around the support for commercialization of lunar resources. That's coming out strongly from the Artemis block. So what kinds of resources are we talking about? NASA started with very early competition on the commercialization of regolith, which is the layer of dust that covers the lunar surface. But that's by far not the only resources that we are looking at. Specifically, we are looking much more at water ice and the possibility of extracting water for further exploration of the lunar surface. So there are craters in permanently shadowed regions, specifically at the poles, that are thought to hold water. We don't know how much water, we don't know how many of them there are, but we do know that that's a really strong possibility, and there's a lot of work in trying to map them, in trying to think about possibilities of access. Some of these areas, such as the permanently shadowed regions, or more geological features like lava tubes, have become kind of like particular sites where different interests have come together. And that is because these are resources that contain resources that can be depleted, or are sites that could be destroyed. And with intensifying exploration that's more and more looking for resources, whether that's through bioprospecting or prospecting in general for different minerals, or drilling for minerals and for mining, these sites are going to become more and more sort of the center of attention of different stakeholders and different sort of different interests. So there have been calls coming up from very many perspectives, starting from planetary geologists such as Killen and others that have called for the lunar environment to be handled with care. But there have also been calls from people that look at international politics and ethics and heritage, to be looking at how that can be irreversible damage to different sites if we're not careful about thinking about what are the priorities for such intensifying lunar exploration. So the idea is that it's important to develop new shared understanding and a path for policy action, so that we don't kind of seal the fate of some of these sites through more and more exploration that is uncoordinated and not only kind of scantily regulated. I am going to pose a couple of minutes on the idea of, on these sites that are the permanently shadowed regions, so that you kind of get an idea of what do I mean when I say there are different interests at play. So PSRs, or permanently shadowed regions, what you're looking at on this map is the south pole of the moon. This is sort of a rendition from NASA of the possibilities of these craters holding water. There's a level of speculation around that, but PSRs are the targets of missions that are interested in water ice. That's why we're seeing a lot of missions going to the South Pole specifically, because hydrogen can be extracted as a fuel for further lunar exploration. So people that are interested in situ resource utilization, they want to extract the water, they're interested in these regions. But also astrobiologists are interested are interested in the PSRs, because PSRs function as cold traps, which means that they hold a record of the organic compounds that are clues into the formation of the solar system. Astronomers are interested in them because they're cold. And so if you put a telescope or kind of hardware in there, you don't need to cool it. So in that sense, there are different ways in which these PSRs could be used to further science, to further exploration. And there are different ways of thinking about the possible priorities and adjudicating them. One way in which the discussion around PSRs and sites of interest has evolved is that there's a lot of calls for zoning the moon. So creating particular zones that are protecting for sites, such as sites of special scientific interest, or for conservation, such as planetary parks, or for heritage, where we can have heritage sites that sort of in places that hold the debris of previous missions, and kind of like sort of border these areas, create kind of like limits around these areas, so that these some of the areas are less contaminated than others. Now, there's been a really recent report from the Open Lunar Foundation around lunar zoning as a possibility for more efficient land management on the moon. And I have been quite critical of this approach for a while, because what I have written about is the relationship between imaginaries of planetary parks as being sort of colonial in their appropriation of the idea that there's nothing there, it's terra nullius, and the value that we associate to particular areas then becomes a subtraction of the value that we think about for the whole of the lunar environment. So that's one way in which these ideas of zoning has been criticized, but there are also other ways in which we can criticize it. And one of them is the fact that zoning won't stop any contamination. The kind of very recent papers from Planetary Protection and have shown how quickly methane exhaust travels from the North Pole to the lunar South Pole in like about 2 lunar days. And through simulation, they have seen that half of that exhaust gets cold trapped in the same craters in permanent shadow that have been trapping sort of the organic compounds that we want to study. So you can see where some of the problems lie. But also one way in which sort of we have to think about zoning as being problematic comes to the fore when we talk about heritage. Heritage sites, the idea of sort of protecting particular type of heritage on the moon makes you ask the question, well, whose heritage? The NASA is very clear that for them heritage means the early Apollo missions specifically. However, when we're looking at the moon and the current state of play, where there's like different missions coming from different countries with different firsts. So, there's a different first rover or new first lander for different countries and emerging space nations. How do you differentiate that? So that's another field of like more and more contestation. And even if we think about the specificity of the early Apollo missions, well, they were never uncontested. And the idea that that kind of heritage is universal, even within the US context, is something that we might want to start thinking a little bit deeper about. So I'm just kind of putting on the slide a reference to Gil Scott-Heron's Whitey on the Moon, which is a spoken word poem from 1970 that clearly denounces the fact that all the spending for the Apollo mission was was a decision that was steeped in racial inequality, because it was a decision made at the same time as there were civil rights protests. And again, the other issue with heritage is how do we differentiate it? So I was saying, oh no, okay, shall we talk about like my first rover or my first lander? But also considering what is already on the moon, it's kind of hard to differentiate sometimes what is heritage and what is junk. You can look in on here on the picture, and you can see on the right hand side the two golf balls that were kind of by Commander Alan Shepard, and you can see them from the lunar from an image from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. These were smuggled on the moon. He didn't have permission to, have a game of golf, but he did. And that, how do we think about that? What sort of heritage is that? And is it an heritage that speaks to a particular ways in which we think about environments such as the moon that are terra nullius because we understand them as not holding sort of life, not hosting life? Right, so I'll just recap a little bit, and then I've got a couple of final slides just to introduce the project that is Moonrise. So I've spoken a little bit about the language of lunar exploration and the imaginaries of lunar exploration, where you can see sort of like a trend of connecting the ways in which we use language about settling and lunar bases together with understandings of lack of life and the idea of wilderness or terra nullius, and parks being particular ways in which we think about environmental protection that is very much has very much been criticized on Earth as being colonial. You can also see how scientific knowledge often trumps, or commercial logics trump, other kind of ways of valuing the moon, and that was exemplified by the Navajo Nation and their claims to the moon. How do we approach field that is so contested and where there are so many competing claims? One way to rethink exploration, once we have set out these kind of territory of competing claims, is to think about care as one way of qualifying a different entry point into exploration. I'm here referring to Nick Bingham's work specifically, and his work with Stephanie Lavaux on care, in particular in the context of food safety. But one thing that's really sort of helpful that Nick's work is providing is this idea of care as the tending of the tensions between different goods. There are different goods at play when we are thinking about space exploration, and how do we hold them together? How do we hold together different perspectives, value, and worldviews that shape the relationships to the moon? How do we show attentiveness to these different ways of expression, to these different expressions of values, and to this different knowledge system, and put them into dialogue? This is very much the ways in which we have conceptualized Moonrise. Moonrise is a project that's been recently funded by UKRI. There's a number of QIs, some are in this room. I won't read all the names, but you'll see them on the slide. And it is conceived as that polyvocal project. So it will use different methodologies to amplify perspectives that are traditionally marginalized in space policy. But it works at the intersection of different disciplines between STEM, FBL, and FAS, and it has external partners with the Space Sustainability Initiative and NASA. But it works across disciplines, but also it works at the interface between academia and policy. That's where my role as convener of the Expert Advisory Group for Guidelines on Lunar Activities, which was funded at the request of the UK Space Agency, but is independent from the UK Space Agency, comes into play. And part of the work that I've been doing with other colleagues for that has been to think about new policy directions that are necessary to preserve the moon as the site of coexistence of many values. And we have started to look at the possibilities and shortcomings of analog sites on Earth, such as Antarctica. So we have written kind of a white paper, and we're turning it into a journal article on looking at sites, protecting sites beyond national jurisdiction from Antarctica to the moon. And what is interesting about looking at that is the ways in which what maybe what we should think about is not necessarily zoning, but rethinking activities and constraining in certain parts, in certain ways, activities. Zoning also brings out a problematic of access, and the first article of the Outer Space Treaty is about sort of enabling access for everybody, like all space actors. So looking at Antarctica and looking at especially protected areas and specially managed areas in Antarctica, which have kind of 2 tiers of protection, gives us an insight into how could we think about the ways of governing the moon differently, that do not only rely on ideas of bordering, but also kind of specify and look at how the environmental protocol in the Antarctic Treaty has defined some of the activities that are permissible and require kind of other ways of sort of surveying those activities, such as environmental impact assessments. Environmental impact assessments are, in my view, are very important. With all their shortcomings that we know about on Earth, they're still an important tool to think about when we are thinking about space activities. So the methodology of Moonrise that tends the tensions of different values and interests at play. Basically what we are trying to do with that is to conceptualize it in one package. And so we are playing a bit, and that's our sort of direction of travel, is to give a little bit more thought into space diplomacy and rethinking space diplomacy as not only the domain of foreign policy, like as we often think about, like, you know, space diplomacy happening between countries or among countries at a particular level of diplomatic activities, but there's a lot that happens underneath that, such as, you know, informing the in countries' position, conversations across different stakeholders in different countries, and the ways in which different knowledges and different types of scientific expertise kind of fill up that box of a particular position in relation to space diplomacy. So space diplomacy as a way to rethink the governance of space, and particularly lunar governance, as a matter of equitability. So what we're trying to do with that is to open the idea of space stakeholdership beyond the sort of the traditional actors of space, and rethinking sustainability in a way that kind of puts the emphasis not only on enabling access today, but safeguarding the future of the moon for future generations. Thank you.